I'm going to go ahead and get us started. And I'd like to start off by welcoming you all and thanking you for being part of Labster's Science Immersed Conference. And today our session is going to be on teaching in the age of AI. I am so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. My name is Christina Fleming, and I am the Chief Marketing Officer here at Labster. I'm looking forward to moderating this session with you, and we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence in education. And wow, this topic has really captured the attention of nearly everyone in education, including all of the many people who have joined this session today. I'll be introducing our guest speakers in just a moment. We have two incredible speakers for you on this topic. But before we begin, of course, a few housekeeping notes, and if you've joined our other sessions, you're probably familiar, but attendees are welcome to ask questions at any time during this session. You can ask questions by using the Q&A icon and selection on Zoom in the bottom panel, and type your question in there, and we will be addressing those towards the latter portion of the session. We've set aside about 10 minutes to make sure that we get to your questions. And if we've missed any questions, you can join us on our campus community where we can continue the conversation. I also, as I've said, I also invite you to use the chat to interact with each other, because we do want to make this as interactive as possible. And now I would like to introduce our two guest speakers. So I'm going to ask them to go ahead and join me here on the screen. Hello, hello, welcome. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Julie Evans. Dr. Evans is the CEO of Project Tomorrow and is the founder of the Speak Up Research Project, which annually collects and reports on the views of over 400,000 K-12 students, parents, and educators on key education issues. Over the past 20 years, over 6.3 million students, teachers, and parents have participated in the Speak Up project, representing over 35,000 schools from all 50 US states, the District of Columbia, and around the world. Dr. Evans serves as the chief researcher on the Speak Up project, as well as leading key research efforts on the impact of innovative learning models and interventions in both K-12 and higher education. Dr. Evans is a graduate of Brown University and earned her doctorate in educational leadership from the University of California, San Diego, and Cal State University, San Marcos. She serves on several boards and is a frequent speaker and writer on new learning models within education, most notably around digital learning. She's also the author of the book Free Agent Learning, and we're going to talk about some of that material today. And among her many accolades and awards, Dr. Evans was named April 2020's winner of the EdTech Digest National Leader Award. Welcome, Julie. Great to have you.
It's wonderful to be here, Chris. What a fabulous group of folks we have. I am so much looking forward to our conversation and learning together with all of you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And next, I'd like to introduce Tamaya Sheldon. Tamaya is a user experience researcher here at Labster, and she has over a decade of experience in education technology and has consistently championed equitable student learning and empowered educators through hands-on curriculum support. She holds a bachelor's degree in cultural anthropology and design and has complemented that with a master's in user experience research, bringing a unique blend of insights to her work. Hello, Tamaya, and welcome to our session.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. I'm quite excited to be here.
Well, actually, I think now I've done the formal introductions, I would love it if you would both maybe say just a couple of words about your background and introduce yourselves to the audience. Julie, do you want to go first?
Happy to, Chris. You know, folks, I have been so privileged to have the opportunity to be the Chief Executive Officer of Project Tomorrow. the last 25 years doing research around the world about the impact of technology. Now, you're all living this. You're right there on the front lines. But I'm happy to bring to our conversation today all of the research that Project Tomorrow has been doing over the last couple of years, not just about the use of technology or what's happening in the classroom, but also the brand new data that we have about what students and teachers and faculty, even parents and leaders are saying about the potential impact of AI on education. Obviously, a very hot topic. And so I'm really thrilled to bring all that research to you today to spur our conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. We're so excited to have you. Tamaya, do you want to say hello?
Sure, absolutely. I've been really lucky and excited to work at Labster just because we've been able to put so much of our focus on our research on our student needs and growth and change, and also making sure that what we're working on is also working for the educators as well. There's such a wonderful ability to kind of match up the needs of your students with the needs of your educators to make sure what we're making serves both groups. So I've been very excited to be here.
Wonderful. And thank you for joining us. All right. So I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and get started. I'll share with the group really quickly that what we're going to do is we're going to start off with some slides from each of our speakers. So they've prepared some information to sort of set the stage for us as we move through this session. And then we're going to take a poll from all of you. So you'll have an opportunity to interact with us and share some of your thoughts about AI. And we'll cover your responses after we've gone through some discussion with Tamaya and Julie. And then at the end, as I mentioned, we'll make sure we cover on questions. So why don't we get started? I think about AI and I realize that it's just really difficult to overstate the changes that AI has brought to the education industry. And wow, it really came on to us fast, right? It's been such a prominent component of the conversation. And we also have headlines that tease dramatic questions to all of us, things like, are our students using AI to cheat? Are human teachers could they be replaced by AI, or teachers for that matter, or students, or all of us becoming too reliant on technology? So there's just a lot of, I think, provocative questions that have been surfaced. And Julie, I'd love to ask you to start this session by sharing the slides that you've prepared and walking us through a little bit about the data that you've gathered and your current impression of this environment. So I'll turn it over to you to bring up those slides and talk through that information.
Certainly, Chris. Does this all look okay, folks?
Yeah,
all right.
Looks great.
As I mentioned, I am thrilled to be here today to bring some research to this conversation. One of the things that I've been talking with a lot of folks about in terms of AI is this understanding that we don't have this all figured out yet. And you may be feeling this as well. We're all feeling a little bit overwhelmed. And there's lots of folks that are giving their opinion, obviously, sharing interesting ideas and insights, talking about the potential of AI, talking about the potential negatives of AI. I was really struck by this particular TED Talk. And if you haven't had an opportunity to take a look at it, I would highly recommend it. And there was a couple of takeaways in terms of what Sal Khan was talking about in his TED Talk that I think are very true and important to ground this conversation today. I agree with him that educators should be active participants in this process of understanding the potential role of AI within education. We can't be silent bystanders. We can't be passive about this. This idea that we can be actively involved in determining the use cases, determining policy, deciding what makes sense, either from an ethical or potential impact on learning standpoint. I think that's all really important to keep in mind. I think it's also important to think about the relationship between AI and our own purpose. And I was also struck by the comment that Saul made in his TED Talk about using artificial intelligence to increase human intelligence and purpose. And so this is what I've been thinking about over the last couple of months, shall we say, in terms of trying to not feel so overwhelmed by AI. Now, what I want to share with you is some data that we have from middle school students and high school students about how they're using some generative AI tools right now. These percentages are based on data from this particular school year that in many K-12 districts is either already ended or will end shortly. It represents a little bit over 25,000 students nationwide in the US. It's really interesting to think about how students are currently using AI, whether it's within a class environment or on their own. But I would like to draw your attention to this one particular statistic. The use of AI tools regularly outside of school. So 45% of high school students and about a third of middle school students told us that, in fact, AI usage is a regular activity for them. You see the percentage in terms of their use in class is much lower. When we've been interviewing students over the past year, we find that in most cases, and again, these are middle school and high school students, not necessarily college students, but what they're telling us is that, in fact, in many cases, their teachers are not talking about AI in their class. They are not incorporating it as part of instruction. But don't be fooled by that. In fact, the students are using AI outside of school. And in many cases, that actually revolves around their social media use. Now, it's also important as we think about AI in education to put ourselves in the mindset of the students in terms of what they're thinking about in their future preparation to be successful. And so one of the other questions that we asked, and I just pulled the high school student data here for you, is that we asked high school students as well as middle school students, what are the types of skills that you think you need to be successful in the future? And I think as we think about the role of AI, as we think about how this is going to impact our instructional practices, our teaching and learning strategies in the classroom, it's important again to seed this within the environment of what the students are currently living in terms of their lives. I was really struck by the first two items that the students identified as their needs, what they're looking to have their learning experiences do for them. And this idea that the students highly value the opportunity to learn on their own and to learn how to work with different types of people, I think is really interesting. And this has really some thoughtful considerations when we think about the role of AI within education. Now, of course, students also think about critical thinking and problem-solving skills, collaboration skills, creativity skills, but the idea that they are focused in on how to learn on their own is really part and parcel of what I talked about in my new book, Free Agent Learners. The fact that students are learning on their own, they're actually using the technology access that they have to drive their own learning destiny is part of this skill development. It's also part of this technology revolution that we have. And so there's many aspects of free agent learning that dovetail in with our conversation around AI, but it's important also to understand that for today's students, learning is not just what's happening in a classroom. It's not just directed by an educator, that they are actually actively learning on their own, using the tools that they have, including AI, to direct their own learning. Now, it's really interesting in my conversations with students around AI, a couple questions keep coming up, and we mentioned in our description of this session, what are the right questions we should be asking? And so I think it's interesting to take a look at what the students are thinking about with AI. And one of the things that we again have to put ourselves in their perspective is that for many years now, this current generation of students, whether they are in your university classrooms and labs, whether they're in a high school classroom or lab, have been using social media and in many cases have been remixing content on social media. So whether that is mimicking a Taylor Swift dance move, taking Bernie Sanders and somehow putting him into Hogwarts and the Sorting Hat, or taking several different images from Instagram and merging those together. The students are very fluent and literate with this idea of remixing content since they've been doing it. So in many ways, when they're thinking about AI, they're thinking of it as just another remix strategy, a remix tool. And so that's very interesting, particularly when we do that binary conversation of cheating versus not cheating, plagiarism versus not plagiarism. It's also interesting because the students are increasingly talking to me about this duality of what are adults allowed to do versus students, and are we looking at it through the same lens? I had a number of students just recently on a panel talk to me about why is it that if they use AI in submitting a paper, shall we say, that is not the type of thing they should do. That's against policy, but it's okay for their teacher or professor to use AI to grade a paper. And so we have to think about this again through the lens of the student in terms of what they're thinking about from their own prior experiences, but also their expectations in terms of the usage of AI. Now, we're going to get much more into this in our conversation, and Chris is going to lead us through a number of questions for us to respond to and think about. But I want to set the stage a little bit with this idea of thinking about this through the student perspective, particularly around what students are currently thinking about with technology, how they're currently using AI, and what some of these big questions are. Chris?
Great. Yeah, thank you. That's wonderful and such a great setup to the conversation that we're going to have. And I'm excited to have that with you and Tamaya. So Tamaya, why don't you go ahead and pull up your slides, and we'll continue to take a look at what we're hearing from students through research. And what's really, I think, really fascinating about this is the research that Julie has done is completely separate, of course, from the research that Labster is doing. And as we go through this, though, I think it'll be interesting to see where there's some similarities and where there may be some differences. But we'll go ahead and pull those slides up. And Tamaya, I turn it over to you.
Perfect. You guys can see this all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I just want to kind of frame this a little bit for the research that I did and remind us a little bit that, you know, we are as humans quite adaptive and really amazing at change and changing ourselves with the current cultural changes. One of the things I thought about when I started looking into students' views on AI is the ease of which they're talking about these new technologies and the kind of comfortableness that they feel about changing and adapting to any kind of new tool. And that's how they are kind of looking at it as, oh, this is just another new tool that's been offered to me as something to improve my life or to make things more fun on Snapchat or Instagram as outside of the classroom support. And it surprised me a little bit that there wasn't so much pushback. And then I thought about my own life and how I've adapted to different technologies. And just thinking about, you know, when I was younger and I started listening to music, I started with records and then moved to cassette tapes and then moved to CDs, MP3 players, and finally it's streaming from a cloud onto my phone in some magical process that I don't quite understand. And as each one of those changes happened, I remember feeling some resistance and a little bit of trepidation about, oh, I have this amazing CD library and now I have to change everything and I have to adapt to this new technology. But the rapidness that we as societies kind of jump into each new successive change is pretty amazing. And it's something for us to keep in mind that even though it might be a little scary as educators, we might have some resistance to this, we as people tend to actually respond pretty quickly and jump on board with these new tools. And then looking at from theory and all these amazing, new things we hear about online to the actual reality, what we actually hear from students is that the majority of learning that's happening is actually happening in what, is kind of traditional ways, textbooks, tutorials from teachers in classrooms, study groups with peers, worksheets, lots of pen and paper. Here in the UK, they've removed a lot of technology from classrooms altogether. Not even phones utilized in lessons anymore. And that is with the kind of rise of concerns about cheating or overusing any AI technology. And so students are now using a lot of handwriting for essays and exams. But it is interesting, and what I've heard, much like with Julie, is that students are using AI outside of the classroom, much in the way that I think my generation used things like Spark Notes as ways to kind of brainstorm ideas. If they have a big essay that's due, they might pop it into AI and say, give me an idea for this essay. And then they take that and they take that framework and they then ideate on their own. Hopefully they aren't pulling too much of information directly from what an AI essay has given them, because they will get in trouble with their teachers and they're aware of that. And also, again, about this idea of kind of the ethics involved. Students have a very different perspective of, well, are my teachers and professors allowed to create content for me versus am I allowed to use this to answer this content that's been provided? And we can go into that again in a moment. And then what we're hearing, what do teenagers like? What are they liking about AI? They really like the artwork. They love that they can make really crazy pictures really easily. We heard a lot about students liking the ability to talk with character AI, where they pick a celebrity and have a conversation. Like I said, the ability to have long essays, a lot of information summarized really quickly for them so that they can get a handle on the information, perhaps in a different way than it's been shown to them through their classroom situation. And then some concerns. Teenagers are aware that the deepfake videos are something that is something they can be they need to be aware of. And we did hear proportionately more from young women that they are worried about images being used in maybe inappropriate ways, and that is a concern for them. And then asking about how could we use AI to enhance their education. They like the idea of their lessons being more interactive. We had a lot of feedback where people were saying, you know, my teacher is the person that I trust to give me this information. Even if I go on an AI site and I get a quote or I get a list of facts, I still want to check this out. I'm going to look secondary sources. I'm going to check in with my teacher. I'm going to check with my peer group. I'm going to look on Google. Google was like the secondary immediate support. Is this fact true? So there is definitely some trust issues here still, which is good. They're using their critical thinking skills to kind of make sure and validate the information being shared is correct. Some students, you know, came back and said, yeah, I don't know. I'm not quite sure if I want to use AI. I feel like it's maybe not great for artists. I feel like maybe it's not great for musicians. They're taking one student said they're just taking this information and mixing it all together. So do your own research and don't trust what is given to you. And students are also aware that it might be causing some problems in the classroom where students who are writing authentic original essays are actually getting flagged as AI created, even though it's not, because of the vocabulary used or because of quotes used. So they could also see some pain points there that maybe as educators, we're not quite catching yet. And then asking students about kind of career paths and then how that's going to AI might impact them. Very large amount of students came back and said they wanted to do something in the arts. And of course, you can quickly realize that if you're an artist or you're a musician and you're a young person and you're thinking, well, how is this going to look in the future if instead of being hired to illustrate a children's book that's going to take me 3 months and a contract, this company can produce the art in 5 minutes. How is this going to impact my career? So they're starting to think about how this might play out for them in the future. And then we asked, are they concerned? And you can see there is some concern here. You have one not at all, a small percentage, and then you've got a mid-ground of, yes, they are concerned about this. They're thinking about this. And then just as a reminder, like what I started with, you know, technological growth, it can be exciting, it's scary, it's rapid, it's a lot of change, but also students and educators, we're flexible, we're strong, and we're adaptable. And I'll turn that back over to you, Christina.
Great, thank you. That was super helpful. Thank you so much. Again, it's been really insightful to see the data coming from both organizations, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about in a minute. But first, what I would like to do is ask Siley to go ahead and pull up a poll for our audience. We're going to take a couple moments here and have you answer some questions for us that we're going to use in our discussion before we get to the Q&A. So what you can see here, there's going to be four questions. Have you tried AI for fun or personal use? Yes or no? Have you used AI for work? Yes or no? Do you think it's okay for an educator to use AI when creating content or grading assignments? Yes, no, I'm not sure. Do you think it's okay for a student to use AI for homework? And that's the last question. And I'll just give you all a few more seconds to finish that. And like I said, we will be sharing the results of our poll towards right before the Q&A section of our session. All right, so as the poll is being filled out, I want to move into our discussion now. So those slides were wonderful in terms of being able to provide us with some data and background. And I thought where we could maybe start is around what we just saw Tamaya present. And that was some information around student perceptions. And Julie, you touched on this as well. And I thought, Julie, if it maybe makes sense to start off with a question around students' perceptions of AI and maybe how your research has either lined up with what you just saw from Tamaya or maybe it differed. I mean, I'm interested in kind of your perspective on student usage and perceptions of AI.
Thank you, Chris. Again, folks, this is just evolving. We are just starting to really see some important use cases developing around AI. In many ways, the students are ahead of us because, as I noted, they are using it more regularly outside of school, self-directed learning, not teacher or faculty member directed. And so what we're seeing is that most of that usage of AI is around social media, that the students are either asking questions of AI because they're curious about something that interests them in the world, or to remix some content and use it in that way. Those are the primary ways that we're seeing students using it. It's a lot of experimentation. There was a video, and I know I provided to the Labster team, and some of you may have had an opportunity to see it, of some students talking to me about their AI usage. And I was struck by a particular example of a young man, a high school junior, who talked about doing some research for his grandmother about a particular science concept. It was a level of medication that was being given to a dog, and what was the background on that particular medication. I think we're seeing that type of usage of AI. We are not seeing, at least on the K-12 side of things, really solid use cases around AI within instruction that then leads to structured use by students. So it's still evolving, Chris.
Mm-hmm. And Tamaya, in terms of what you shared and what you were just showing us, it looked like you saw as well sort of this spectrum of perceptions that maybe I know for myself, I was a little surprised to see that spectrum. Can you speak to that and maybe how that might line up with what Julie just shared?
Yeah, I think it's very true. Definitely a large proportion of students are using this in different like social media formats. But we also did hear from some students who said, well, I used some AI to make me flashcards to revise on some history topics, and it was able to provide a lot of quick answers and questions that would have taken them quite a long time to pull out of their textbook, which I thought was a really interesting use case. And also their perception on making sure that the information that they're using for school is not as trusted, and they don't feel like it's quite as validated, But if they're using it for fun or for their own interest-driven study, they tend to have more trust there. Maybe if it's something that they're keenly interested in studying on their own outside of school, they already have kind of a deep dive into different topics and research on their own, so they know that it's trustworthy information. Or if it's social media, they're not necessarily concerned whether or not this filter is accurate or this little bit of information is true. It's more of a fun environment than a kind of educational space.
Yeah, and so along those lines, Julie, with trust that Tamaya just shared with us, have you seen sort of a dichotomy in terms of trust from students in terms of their responses to you when you talk about AI?
And again, yes, Chris, let's see this again in terms of the overall use of technology. So we have always seen in our 20 years of research with students that there are some students that use some tools and some that don't want to. So we have to think about that again in this context, that it's not an all or no one. It's actually based on personal preference, what the students actually see as the role of AI in helping them. You know, we have always documented in our reports that for most students, technology is just a utility. It's just a way to get from A to B. It's just a way to increase their effectiveness. And so students are bringing that same mindset into this conversation around AI. They are looking at this as a utility, and they will use it where it makes sense in this job versus maybe not in this job associated with their learning. But there's still a lot of experimentation that is happening out there. And in terms of the trust standpoint, you know, I think one of the things that is interesting, we hear a lot from the media, right? And media sometimes will take a little tiny statistic and blow it up into a great big headline. You know, just as there are students that don't use different types of technology or that isn't their thing, we're seeing the same thing in terms of whether or not they're looking at the results of an AI generated query as being valid or not, and what students are doing to help authenticate those resources. You know, we have, at least in the US, and I can't speak to our colleagues that are here with us from around the world, but at least in the US, we have not done a really solid job in terms of helping students develop information and media literacy skills as part of regular instruction. We're behind the 8 ball on that. And so here we are confronted with AI generated content, and then we are thinking about it from the context of, well, how do students know if this is valid or not? Well, we haven't really helped students give them the tools that they need. Only about a third of high school students in our national survey this year, again, those 11,000 students nationwide, only about a third told us that they feel that they have really good information and media literacy skills. So that is a wake-up call for us as education leaders, as educators, to be thinking about how we're approaching that conversation around whether we trust or whether students trust the feedback. We have to dial this back a little bit and look at it within that context.
Yeah, I agree. And we've had some comments in the chat as well that sort of are bringing forward just this notion of whether AI is creating a positive experience for students, and then also thinking about it from the lens of, as we present it in terms of being educators, adults, people maybe who have gone through several, rounds of technological change in our lifetime, and questioning sometimes, that trust issue of whether AI is creating a sense of mistakes that could be made in the tool itself, or is it able to enhance critical thinking? And you both kind of touched on this idea of critical thinking and some of the aspects that AI maybe would leave an area of opportunity for. So I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit around this notion of critical thinking and students' perception of using AI from that lens.
Yeah. I will say what I have heard and seen is that this is making students pay more attention to the content that is on the screen. They're having to be a little bit more critical. They're having to be a little bit more careful with the information because they are questioning, like, where is this coming from? Is this image true? Did this singer actually create this song? Who's actually saying this quote? And it's making them, I don't want to say suspicious, but it's making them kind of pause for a second before just absorbing information and saying, this is a fact, and going, well, hold on, how do I know this is real? How can I check this source? Which is something that is, I think, kind of a new skill set. Much like Julie just said, we're not really teaching a really critical analysis skill set of when you see something on the internet, how do you make sure that this is true and correct? And I think, you're hearing students say, well, I know that AI text I can recognize it now. I can see the syntax. I know how something sounds. They're really quickly adapting to recognize what is quote unquote real and not real, as the same thing as how we have all very quickly adapted to noticing what AI art looks like. I mean, over the course of a few months, we can now look at something and say, that is AI generated versus that is not. And it's a skill set that we weren't prepared for, but we were able to quickly adapt to.
That's right. Julie, any thoughts?
I think that this is, and again, I go back to this, I think that there is still a lot of work to be done in thinking about how we're approaching AI, particularly in the classroom. And I'm struck by so many of the comments. What a thoughtful group we have here today, Chris, in terms of comments. I'm a huge fan of chat culture in online events like this, and what a thoughtful group. I think that when we think about authenticating resources, when we think about using AI resources to support learning, part of the conversation has to be around what is the purpose of school and classroom today. And so, again, dialing back a little bit and pausing and saying, well, let's put this AI conversation in the context of what we believe to be the traditional teaching and learning environment may be the mismatch here. That maybe what we should be thinking about is, what does that future classroom look like? And how does AI then fit into that? And when we think about the types of skills that students need to be successful in this information intensive, globally connected world, this idea of using AI as the stimulus to thinking differently about instruction, I think could be super powerful. But it's hard work. Right? It's hard work to sit back and say, let me re-engineer the way I've been thinking about instruction.
Yeah, so along those lines, it's making me want to ask about, your research in either case with either of you in terms of educators. So we know we have a number of educators here in this session today, and we'll hear from them in a moment in the poll. But in terms of what your research has shared and what you mentioned, Julie, around the classroom environment, what have we heard so far in terms of how educators are relying on AI in the classroom space?
So I'll start with, again, some of the Speak Up research. And again, this is primarily US based. We are only seeing about 7% of middle school and high school teachers in the US that say they're regularly using AI. And this is data from this school year. You may have remembered my statistic on high school students was 45% say they're regularly using AI outside of school. So we have a mismatch in terms of familiarity, in terms of usage, in terms of what some of those tools could be. That then is driving fear, right? And we know that fear can be a very strong motivator for inaction. And so we're not seeing a lot of usage, at least not this past school year, because a lot of school districts, K-12 school districts, are waiting for policy. The K-12 school district tends to run on policy and guidelines, and many school district leaders are still trying to figure out what their policy should be. Should we allow teachers to use AI, but not students? Should we allow them to use only certain products? Should we license products? I mean, in many cases, part of the conversations are around what AI is currently in the products that we're already using that we didn't even realize that they were there. So there's a whole education process that's happening. We are not seeing in our data, and this is different than a year ago, we are not seeing educators say you have to ban AI in school. That is gone now. We're also not seeing, at least in the K-12 environment, as much concern about AI as a vehicle for cheating as we saw before. But again, that might just be a lack of familiarity. We are seeing a mismatch between educators' perspectives on whether it's going to be a positive or whether it's going to be a negative, and particularly what the social and ethical components of that look like. So there's a lot that is still coming together. Chris has heard me say this before. This whole conversation around AI is not jello yet. It's not firmed up. We don't have use cases. We don't have solid policies. We don't have ways of thinking about students. There's some interesting glimmers, some little sparklers out there of things that are intriguing, but we haven't really pulled it all together yet. And that's what the educators are feeling. And I think when they think about an apprehension, when they think about a fear, it's coming from that unsettledness regarding AI.
Yes, absolutely. I love that analogy. It's not jello yet. Tamaya, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would say most of the university or college educators that I spoke with in the US are having a very similar kind of reaction. There's very little actual usage. And it's not necessarily because the institutions are saying, we don't want you doing this. Although I will say, I did hear from 2 people who said their whole school was not allowed to use Grammarly anymore because it now has AI embedded in it. And so there are some small changes happening across the board at some schools. So that's something for us to be kind of just aware of. But I think the biggest thing is right now people don't really know how and why they are going to use this technology. They know that it looks cool. They know that it seems interesting. The kind of early adopters who are like, well, it's been helping me generate questions for my classroom. It can pull up a lot of information and statistical facts that I can use really quickly, which is, time saving. Anything that's going to save time is going to be a friend to a teacher. And then, a lot of the professors are saying, actually, no, thank you. I have my way of teaching. It works well for me. It's taken me many years to get to this place where I know how to work with my students. And I'm not really interested in learning any new processes at this moment. So it kind of needs to prove its value to them before they're willing to jump on board.
Yeah, absolutely. And it actually brings me to thinking a little bit about student engagement. And I want to touch on this just briefly before we take a look at the results of our poll. Julie, as we think about the impacts of AI, one of the areas that I'm interested in hearing more about is the connections that you've made from the perspective of student agency and student learner agents that you talked about in your book, with how AI might play a role in that, in helping them in become more engaged in their learning through their own agency. And I wondered if you could touch on that briefly.
Absolutely. One of the things that we have seen, and I wrote about it in my book, Free Agent Learning, is that if we pay attention to what students are doing outside of school, self-directing learning, outside of the classroom, where they feel a great deal of agency, they feel that they are effective learners, they have self-efficacy around learning. If we pay attention to what they're doing outside of school, it can actually give us a lot of cookie crumbs in terms of what the types of learning experiences could be in the classroom. And that's the same thing for AI. As we pay attention to what students are doing outside of school, what their curiosities are, how they're utilizing AI as a tool, it's very interesting to start thinking about what that means in the classroom. Now, the reason that's important, and I think this is what you would like me to share here, Chris, is in our research around student engagement in the classroom. And again, my data is from middle school and high school students. Since 2018, we have been polling students on their level of engagement and what they're learning in their classroom. And folks, only 50% of middle school and high school students say they are engaged in what they are learning in school most of the time. We have an engagement crisis in education. I just finished a workshop for Cal State San Marcos with a number of faculty across all different divisions and departments and schools. And the primary topic from them was about student engagement, that they have seen a change in the level of engagement down from what it has been. The pandemic didn't create that. Our data shows us that that engagement crisis was in place before the pandemic, through the pandemic, and still exists today. So as we think about changing our teaching and learning strategies, our instructional practices, to engage students, to help them develop agency, to help them develop that self-efficacy around learning, whether it's with the use of AI or not. This idea of looking at what students are doing outside of school, self-directing learning, can be such a valuable set of insights. I just think it's a wealth of thoughtful considerations for all of us.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I love those thoughts. Let's go ahead, Siley, if we could share the results of our poll. I'd love for our two guests to take a look at these results. So have you tried AI for fun or personal use? Looks like we have 79% saying yes, they have. So from the group here on our session today. We have 82% saying they have used AI for work. We have 67% saying that they think it's okay for an educator to use AI when creating content or grading assignments. 28% said they're not sure. And then we have sort of a split group on whether it's okay for a student to use AI for homework. The leading group says yes. Some say not sure. And then a group of 19% say no. So Tamaya, I'm going to ask you first. What are your thoughts, reactions? I mean, given that you do research all the time, does this line up with what you might have expected?
You know, it's really interesting to me because it does. In the student research, the students really do say that it is okay for an educator to use AI to create learning material or learning content or grading. They feel much better about that. When it came to, is it okay for you as a student to use AI? They're really conflicted. They're not sure. And I don't know if this is because they're not sure it's allowed or they're not sure if it's ethically right. So there's no distinction here, but it is interesting that the educators are kind of reflecting this as well. There's a little bit of like, is it okay for them to use the homework? Whereas it feels more okay for them to be creating content. And, you know, to be honest, from an outsider perspective, as not somebody in the classroom, it actually logically makes sense to me that an educator would say like, yes, I can pull from a lot of sources because I know these sources are correct. And what I'm sharing with my students is good information. And I feel that I can trust what I've created is true for them. It's validated information. So it's very interesting to see this.
Yeah, absolutely. Julie, what are your thoughts as you look at this poll?
So it's so interesting. I was struck by, with questions 3 and 4, the high percentage of participants we have here today that said not sure. This is very similar to some polling that we're doing right now with educators around AI. And we're also seeing very high percentages of educators that are choosing the not sure option in questions such as these. You know, in my 20 some odd years of doing this research, when I see particularly professionals, educators, over 20 to 25% of them choosing not sure, that tells me that there's still a lack of familiarity and a lack of understanding of where we're going with this. And so we see that here, particularly in terms of the 18 to 21% that said they haven't used an AI product. They don't have that sort of level of personal familiarity. So I think that is really interesting. I think that the jury is still out, shall we say, in terms of what this means, whether it is okay for educators to use it or if it's okay for students to use it. I keep coming back to this use case conversation. You know, what are some good use cases that we should be talking about and actually developing value propositions around it. In our research in all these years, we've always seen that we can't get to the place of an educator saying, oh, I'm going to incorporate AI into my teaching and learning until we develop a solid value proposition that it brings some delta benefits. It makes me more efficient. It makes me, it saves time, whatever that might be. So we have some work to do to figure that out. And I see that coming up in our comments today also.
Yes, absolutely. And we talked about, these areas of critical thinking, the soft skills, the aspects of idea creation. All of these are really exciting, I think, from an AI perspective and how it can augment learning. So I think I see Siley has joined us. Hello. So that probably means it's time for some Q&A. I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Siley, to share some of the questions that we've gotten from our session.
Yes. Hi. I almost hate to break this up because it's been such a good session. I've learned so much and I've really, really enjoyed the conversation, but we do unsurprisingly have a bunch of questions for our wonderful panel here. So one of the ones that I really enjoyed and I really want to know as well is, how do you see AI's role evolving in education over the next 5 years?
Who wants to take that one first?
I think it's, I think that we know how this is going to go. Now, I know that seems like, how do you know? We're going to see an adoption curve. We have some early adopters that are currently doing some experimentation. They're doing some things, whether that's students or educators. They're starting to develop those use cases, starting to develop those value propositions. We then will see some other folks that will come on board with it. I think we're going to see a pretty standard adoption curve of AI in the classroom. The difference is going to be that because the AI space is changing so dramatically, almost on a daily basis, we are going to see that adoption curve change even more quickly. I think that so it'll be speeded up. I think that the idea of identifying a couple of areas where AI can provide some additional benefits right away are important for this conversation. And this came up in one of the comments very early on in our conversation today. I think particularly around accessibility and having accessible learning materials and learning experiences for students, no matter what their strengths or weaknesses, where they have challenges, where they don't, where they need some extra support. I think that's one of the most promising ones. And I expect to see more usage and more conversation around that area starting off as we go through this adoption curve.
Great. Tamaya, what are your thoughts?
Where I would hope for it to go is just to really kind of embody students to have really specific educational pathways that allow them to dive into their interests that still tie into their core learning models that they must have. We know that some students will only engage if it's a topic they really truly care about. And there are ways to tie in every single topic to whatever that thing is. If you love trains and you have a student who only wants to talk about trains, let's tie in some math lessons there. Let's tie in some history. Let's tie in geography. It's possible, but it takes a massive amount of time and resources. This is a place where I see AI being a really kind of star, where if you have a way to tie in each individual student's really true passions, and that's their interest that drives the learning, then you've got an engaged student. Then you've got an engaged classroom full of really independent, interesting learners. And that's kind of where I would hope it would go.
Yeah, I love that. That's wonderful. I hope as well.
I love that answer. I wish I had more professors like all of you. What are some successful examples of AI being used in a classroom?
Tamaya, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say what I've heard is the ability to really quickly create a list of questions for a classroom, like kind of on the fly. If you've got a student who asks a question that's not on your curriculum, that wasn't part of your learning objectives, but you want to follow their interest, it is able to kind of pull up a bunch of information for you really quickly. And I know I've kind of mentioned speed a few times, but that is kind of the differing factor of AI versus us Googling. Instead of going through a library of content and information, we're being kind of handed over a curated list, which is why we then have to kind of check it and make sure it's correct. But the quickness of that is kind of where I see the strength coming in and being really helpful in a classroom.
Mm-hmm. Idea creation. That's how we often use it in my world in marketing.
Yeah.
Julie, any thoughts from you on that question?
Similar to what Tamaya said, this idea of summarizing research, summarizing ideas. I've seen it used very effectively, not just to stimulate student writing, but student discussion. And so whereas we can use it from a discussion standpoint, I think that's really interesting, particularly if there's different points of view that can be brought to the students. You know, too often in our classroom, students may all be coming from the same demographic group, have had the same type of experiences, and where you can bring these different points of view in, those can be very good stimulants to conversation. And then I'll go back again to this idea of accessibility. How can we make sure that the learning materials that we have are being presented to students in ways that support their learning? So, excuse me, I think that one is particularly interesting from an equity standpoint in terms of making sure that students have equitable learning experiences.
Absolutely. Sally, do we have time for one more, or do we want to?
Yeah, I'm gonna put it out there, but you know, just for the sake of time, this will be the last one we can answer. But any ones that don't get answered here, we'll make sure to get you an answer after the session. So the last one that I love your quick inputs in are, what are the best practices for ensuring that AI is used ethically and responsibly in the classroom?
I think it starts with having that conversation with your students. I think that too often what we're seeing is educators are even afraid to have that conversation. And I don't mean afraid in the sense of, oh my gosh, you know, what's going to happen? They are reticent because they feel they don't know enough to start that conversation. But you can't get into a conversation about the social or ethical uses of AI as a standalone without having the context of the larger conversation. So I think that starting off, and in particular for the educators that are here with us today, asking your students, what are you doing with AI outside of the classroom? What sort of experiences have you had? What have you learned from this? Where are your concern points? Where are the things that you think we all should be paying attention to? So it starts with having that conversation as the best practice.
Tamaya, I see you nodding your head.
100%. I agree. 100%. Student-led discussions, understanding how and why they are using it, and how that all of these kind of rules around it need to be framed. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's a great way to end our discussion today. I know that there were more questions. As we said, we can continue that conversation on our community campus here at Labster. I will just offer that we have a session coming up next. Our brains love to learn, so why don't our students? So check that out at the top of the hour. And with that, I want to thank our speakers today, Julie and Tamaya. Absolutely amazing conversation. I feel so honored to have been here. And I want to also thank our audience for joining us. And gosh, the chat was amazing. Just all the interaction on the chat was really wonderful. So thank you for that. And thank you, Sally. Thank you, Julie and Tamaya. And we'll talk to you all soon. Have a